So we got new unemployment data on Friday, and a lot of people are confused. Some people say it's good news, other people say it's bad news. Some people say it should be bad, but it's good. Other people say it's good news, but it means that it's bad news. And people are generally confused because the payroll numbers are increasing over time, but unemployment is either running flat, and now actually we've got a bit of an uptick in unemployment, which obviously doesn't make sense, because if you have new jobs, why is unemployment going up? But it actually does make sense. So, first of all, why are people saying that the good news is bad news? And that's actually because if unemployment data is good, meaning there's unemployment is low, then it means that the Feds will obviously hike interest rates. If the Feds hikes interest rate, it means that obviously businesses that have a high debt to equity ratio, they're going to be in trouble. It also means that access to money is more difficult. So it's going to be difficult for businesses to raise money for future sort of endeavors. What's the word? I can't think of the word now, but future ventures. And obviously that will affect growth, and that will obviously affect the stock price. So all in all, it's bad for the stock market. But I digress, back to unemployment. So first off, let's just talk about the accuracy of these numbers. These numbers are not very accurate. So it's not, some people believe the numbers are cooked. I don't believe it's cooked. It's just very difficult to get them to be accurate. So these numbers, most of these numbers, I think actually all of them come from the BLS, which is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So every month they have to release these numbers. And I think if it was once a year, it would have been a bit easier. But because it has to be every month, they can't count all the people. They can't go and physically count and basically interview each person in the United States and find out what their job situation is. So what they do is they actually take a small sample of people, which is roughly 60,000 households, and then they basically do a study on them, and they ask them certain questions. And then based on the answer of these questions, they can then say, okay, cool, obviously there's a certain percentage of them that's unemployed, a certain percentage of them in this age group, etc., etc., etc. And then these percentages, they can apply to the population of the US, and then they sort of get numbers. So obviously these numbers are not going to be very accurate, purely because you need to produce a number every month. There's also been a study produced. I'll link it in the description. Very, very interesting. It's a very difficult read. You kind of have to be a rocket scientist to understand it properly. But basically, it's about if you have a subset of these households, these 60,000 households, how often you actually interview them and ask the questions. The answers actually change, even though the actual real life situation of the people didn't change. So it's all like the psychology behind the study, and how they even have to take this group, and over time you have to use the same individuals, but you have to also take a part out and you have to roll new ones in, purely to keep the statistics as accurate as it can be. So yeah, it's also after this, as well as obviously lots of calculations, they're going to find that there's some issues, so they sort of do a bit of guessing. Basically what they then do is they have a number called the confidence interval. That's basically how reliable these numbers are. Some of these numbers are really, really unreliable, but we'll get to that. So the next thing we need to look at is what these numbers actually mean. So these numbers all point to groups of people. The sort of the headline figure is always the unemployment rate. It's actually a percentage of a very small group of people. So on the top, obviously you get the US population. That's everybody in the US. In that group of people, you get your working age population. So that's roughly that's basically people between the age of 15 and 64 years of age. And I think it's people that's not in the military, and there's a couple of other exclusions to this. Inside that, you have the participation rate, which is basically your labor force participation. It's also just called your labor force. And that's basically people that want to work. So they like, I want to work, and then some of them obviously find jobs, some don't find jobs. So in that group, you have that group is split into two, which is your unemployment and your employed people. So, and inside unemployment, there's another two groups, which is newly unemployed or continuous unemployment, like they're employed for a longer period. So these are the different groups that you have to sort of look at. And these numbers obviously all point to a size of the group, like an actual population, or the group in relation, or a percentage of the group in relation to a parent group, a bigger group. So for instance, the unemployment rate is a percentage of the workforce or the labor force participation. So if you know a number of people, how many actual people are in the labor force, then you can calculate actually a number, how many people are unemployed. So that we call the stock. So the stock is what's happening now, right? Now at this moment, the population is a certain amount of people. The working age population is another amount of people. The participation rate or the labor force is another amount of people. And obviously in there, your employment and unemployment is another number of people. That's the current state. Then you get what we call the flow of people. That's basically the movement of people. So it's the current state minus the previous state. And that obviously happens once a month. So every month we get a new figure, and that is this month's figure, and then we subtract last month's figure. Because these circles, over time, they grow and shrink as months go by. So basically, it's the change in stock. So the change in stock is also your flow. And that's where your payrolls come in. So you get your non-farm payrolls, which is basically, that's employment, or that's the change of the employed sector inside your labor force. That's only that part inside your labor force, how that changes over time, whether it grows or shrinks. But the reason it's called non-farm is just because it's not farm workers. It's everyone excluding farm workers. And there's also a couple of other things it also excludes. Payrolls is the change in the employment group. And the interesting thing is it doesn't actually mention where these changes come from. So payrolls at the moment is quite big. So it means that this employment group is growing. But it doesn't say where they're coming from. Are they coming from the unemployment group? Are they coming from the age, the working age population, or are they coming from the population? Because obviously every month you might have somebody that just turned 15 and went looking for a job. And he might just get a job. That means that specific person went from the population into the working age population, into the labor force, into employment. So they basically skip a couple of groups, if you want to call it that. It's not a simple plus minus, if this goes up, that goes down. Because some of the people obviously come from the population, others come from the working age, others come from the labor force, aka unemployment, etc., etc. So that does make it a bit complex. So what's happening? Why? Where's people going? Where they're coming from? What's actually happening now? Since COVID, when COVID struck, there was a massive dip in our working age population. So working age population shrunk quite a bit. And since then, up until now, it's slowly been increasing again. So people are joining the workforce again. And there was also a very interesting spike in the population in the beginning of this year by about 2 million. I assume it's incorrect. I assume it's some different way of them counting the data. It might be that because of COVID, they weren't able to do it properly. And now, since COVID is sort of a thing of the past, now they're doing it properly again. So maybe just a correction. But once again, you have to keep in mind that these numbers aren't accurate. They are very, very estimated. But if you do look at these numbers over time, it does tell a story. You can see if it's growing or shrinking. the more numbers you put together or the more readings you basically average out, the more reliable your data will actually be. So what does it mean? So my theory is on this, is that since COVID, a lot of people obviously have lost their jobs, but instead of going from employed to unemployed, they left the labor force and they went back into the working age population, but they're not in the labor force. The reason for this is that obviously they got a lot of stimmy checks. You can actually see this in the M2 money supply. If you look at the M2 money supply curve, you can see that's been a major increase in savings accounts. So the M2 money supply is basically how much money is sitting in bank accounts owned by people and businesses. That's the money supply. So people have gotten richer from these stimmy checks and they didn't actually need to work. Obviously now we can see with, since I think it was February, March, the stimmy checks were stopped. So you can see the M2 money supply actually shows that because it's flatlining a little bit. And, if you look at the revolving credit, you can see that the revolving credit is going up. So the revolving credit is basically credit cards. It's mainly credit cards that people take out and the amount of basically how far they are in the negative. If you add all of this up, it'll be revolving credit. So a lot of people are using credit cards now, which shortly after the pandemic, so just after the pandemic, they actually use their stimmy checks to pay off their credit card. And now they basically are going and using their credit card again, which basically means that people have a lot of money. They've got access to money. So I think a lot of people just didn't need to work. They just had enough money, so they didn't need to work. They just, first of all, lived off their stimmy checks, and now they've all moved onto credit cards. But this basically has left a lot of companies to be understaffed because your labor force has shrunk. But I mean, the amount of companies out there is still pretty much the same. Yes, there's been a couple of places that have gone down after the pandemic, but in general, your labor force shrinkage has been much more than there's actually companies that went under. So companies are looking for staff, but they're not finding staff. So there's a lot of positions available. So what actually happens is that I think as people run out of money, so they're maxing out their credit cards, they're out of stimmy checks, they have to find jobs. So what they do is they go from the working age population straight into employment. They don't go into unemployment first. They go from the working straight into employment. And that's where those payrolls are coming from. That's people that weren't in the labor force. So they're not coming from unemployment. They're coming from basically no employment. And so that's why now the labor force participation group is actually growing, but it's growing faster than people joining. So because it's growing faster, your unemployment can still go up, but your change in your employment group is also higher. So that's basically what's happening now. And that's where all the confusion is coming in. Because unemployment's going up, but we're also getting more jobs. But they don't tell you where it's coming from. It's not coming from the unemployment group. It's coming from the working age population. People that are not employed are going straight into employment without going through unemployment. So yeah, I've left a lot of links in the description if you want to read up on this. It's very interesting stuff. If you like the video, then please remember to press the button. And if you want to see more, remember to subscribe. This is Steve. Until next time, ciao.